$10 million, 97 days, two men I trusted completely, $0 left. But they made one fatal mistake. They assumed I'd stay silent and let them win.
Before I share this journey, make sure to subscribe for more powerful life stories that will touch your heart.
I never thought I'd be the kind of person to tell this story. For the longest time, I believed that silence was dignity, that keeping family secrets was loyalty, that turning the other cheek was strength. But silence, I've learned, can be its own kind of prison, and some betrayals are too profound to bury in politeness and shame. My name is Claire, and this is the story of how I lost everything, and what I did to get it back. The first time I realized my father was dying, I was standing in the fluorescent-lit hallway of Cedar Ridge Medical Center, watching him through the window of room 204. He was connected to more machines than I could count, his weathered farmer's hands looking pale and fragile against the white hospital sheets. At 64, William Patterson had never looked old to me before that moment. He'd always been this towering presence, 6'3" with shoulders that could carry the weight of the world, hands that could coax life from stubborn soil, and eyes the color of summer storms. The pancreatic cancer is aggressive, Dr. Martinez had said earlier that morning, her voice gentle but unflinching. We're looking at months, not years. Months. The word echoed in my mind as I pressed my palm against the cool glass separating me from the man who had been my entire world since my mother died when I was 12. My father and I had weathered everything together. Her death, my teenage rebellion, my college years, my marriage to David 3 years ago. We'd built our lives around the rhythm of seasons on our family farm in Willowbrook, Tennessee. 800 acres of the most beautiful land you've ever seen. Rolling hills dotted with white oak trees and a creek that ran crystal clear even in the driest summers. Claire, my husband David's voice pulled me from my reverie. He stood beside me, his hand finding mine with that gentle pressure that had first made me fall in love with him. David worked as a financial advisor at Willowbrook Community Bank, and his calm analytical nature had always balanced my emotional intensity. He was everything my father had hoped I'd find in a husband, stable, kind, ambitious, but not at the expense of family values. I don't know how to do this without him, I whispered. David squeezed my hand. You won't have to. We'll figure it out together. That was 3 months ago. 3 months of driving back and forth between our small house on Maple Street and the hospital, of watching my father's strong body waste away while his mind remained sharp and determined. 3 months of treatments that bought us time but couldn't buy us miracles. It was on a Tuesday morning in October, with autumn painting the Tennessee hills in shades of gold and crimson, that my father made the decision that would change everything. I found him sitting up in bed, more alert than he'd been in weeks, with a manila folder spread across his lap table. Outside his window, I could see the parking lot of Cedar Ridge Medical Center, where my blue Honda Civic sat next to pickup trucks and minivans, the vehicles of a community where people still knew their neighbors and helped each other through hard times. Morning, sweetheart, he said, his voice stronger than it had been in days. We need to talk. I settled into the vinyl chair I'd worn smooth over the past months, noting the way the morning light caught the silver in his hair. What's on your mind, Daddy? He'd always been Daddy to me, never Dad or Father. It was one of those childhood habits that had stuck. Probably because losing my mother so young had made our bond even more precious and intimate. He's made a decision about the farm, he said, his weathered hands steady as he opened the folder. The Brennan Development Group made an offer, $12.5 million for everything, the land, the house, the outbuildings. I'm going to take it. The words hit me like cold water. Daddy, no. That land has been in our family for 4 generations. Great-grandfather Patterson cleared those fields with his own hands. And now his great-great-granddaughter is going to benefit from his hard work in ways he could have never imagined. My father's voice was firm but kind. Claire, honey, this medical battle has cost us everything we've saved. The experimental treatments, the specialists in Nashville, even with insurance, were drowning in debt. I stared at the paperwork spread before him, recognizing the familiar letterhead of Patterson and Associates, the law firm that had handled our family's legal matters for decades. There has to be another way. There is no other way, and even if there was, this is what I want. He reached for my hand, his grip still strong despite everything. That money is going to give you something I could never provide otherwise. Complete financial freedom. You'll never have to worry about a mortgage payment or a medical bill or whether you can afford to send your children to college. Children. David and I had been talking about starting a family, but the timing had never seemed right with my father's illness. Now the future felt impossible to imagine. I've already spoken with Robert Henley at the bank, my father continued. He's arranging for the entire amount to be transferred directly into your personal account as soon as the sale closes, $10 million after taxes and legal fees. Robert Henley had been the president and senior loan officer at Willowbrook Community Bank for 15 years. He'd approved the loan for David and me to buy our house, had handled my father's farm operating loans, and had been a fixture in our small community for as long as I could remember.
He was a soft-spoken man in his early 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of old-fashioned courtesy that made you feel like you were in good hands. "Robert's a good man," my father said, as if reading my thoughts. "He'll take care of you and David. Make sure that money works for your future." I wanted to argue, to fight for the land that had shaped my entire identity, but one look at my father's face told me this wasn't a debate. This was his final gift to me, his way of ensuring that his death wouldn't destroy the life he'd worked so hard to build for his daughter. "Okay, Daddy," I whispered, tears blurring my vision, "if that's what you want." "It's what I need, sweetheart. Promise me you'll use it wisely. Promise me you'll build something beautiful with it." I promised, though I had no idea then what that promise would cost me. My father died on a Sunday morning in November, just as the first frost was settling on the fields he would never see planted again. I was holding his hand when he took his last breath, David on my other side, both of us crying silent tears in the quiet of room 204. The funeral was held at Willowbrook Methodist Church, the same white clapboard building where I'd been baptized, confirmed, and married. The sanctuary was packed beyond capacity, with mourners spilling out into the fellowship hall and even onto the front steps. Farmers in their best suits sat beside teachers from the elementary school where I'd once been a student and later a substitute teacher. Local business owners, bank employees, and even some of the development company representatives came to pay their respects. Pastor Williams delivered a eulogy that captured everything my father had been. A man of quiet faith who measured success not in dollars, but in the health of his soil and the well-being of his community. He'd employed local teenagers every summer, donated produce to the food bank during abundant harvests, and served on the school board for 12 years without missing a single meeting. William Patterson understood that the greatest legacy a man can leave isn't found in bank accounts or property deeds, it's found in the character of his children and the impact he has on the lives he touches. After the service, we made the procession to Willowbrook Cemetery, where 4 generations of Pattersons were buried beneath ancient oak trees that had shaded their eternal rest for over a century. I stood beside the grave in my black dress, David's steady presence beside me, as my father was laid to rest next to my mother in a plot that had been waiting for him for 23 years. As the mourners began to disperse, each stopping to offer condolences and share memories, I felt simultaneously empty and overwhelmed. Empty because the man who had been my anchor, my compass, my safe harbor was gone. Overwhelmed because I was now responsible for honoring his memory and his final wish. "The sale closed yesterday," David told me quietly as we walked back to our car. "The Robert called while you were getting dressed this morning. The money has been transferred to your account. $10 million. I tried to wrap my mind around that number, but it felt abstract, almost meaningless. Growing up on a farm where we considered ourselves blessed to have a good year if we cleared $50,000 in profit, I couldn't comprehend wealth on that scale. "What do we do now?" I asked. David stopped walking and turned to face me, his hands gentle on my shoulders. "Now we honor his memory by being smart with this gift, and we start planning the future he wanted you to have." The next morning, still numb with grief but determined to handle my father's affairs responsibly, David and I made the short drive to Willowbrook Community Bank. The building sat on the corner of Main Street and First Avenue, a solid red brick structure that had anchored our small downtown since 1952. Inside, the atmosphere was deliberately traditional: dark wood paneling, brass fixtures, and faded photographs of Willowbrook's founders, most of whom had been farmers like my father. Robert Henley's office was on the second floor, with windows overlooking Main Street where you could watch the daily rhythm of small-town life. His secretary, Mrs. Duncan, had taught Sunday school in our church for 30 years and had known me since I was in pigtails. "Claire, honey," she said, rising from her desk to embrace me, "I'm so sorry for your loss. Your daddy was one of the finest men this town ever produced." "Thank you, Mrs. Duncan. That means everything to me." Robert emerged from his office as we spoke, looking appropriately somber in his navy suit and conservative tie. At 51, he had the kind of stable, trustworthy appearance that small-town bankers seem to cultivate: graying temples, kind eyes, and a firm handshake that conveyed both sympathy and competence.
"Claire, David," he said, embracing me briefly before shaking David's hand, "please accept my deepest condolences. Your father was not just a valued client, but a dear friend." We settled into his office, with its leather chairs and mahogany desk that had probably been there since the bank opened. Robert spread several documents before us, his movements careful and deliberate. The wire transfer from Brennan Development was completed yesterday at 4:17 p.m. $10,400,000 has been deposited into your personal account.
I took the liberty of preparing some investment recommendations that I believe would serve your long-term interests. I stared at the bank statement he slid across the desk. $10,400,000. Even seeing it in black and white, the number seemed unreal. This is overwhelming, I admitted. Of course it is, Robert said kindly. That's exactly why your father asked me to help guide you through this transition. With this amount of money, proper financial management becomes crucial. David leaned forward eagerly. What do you recommend, Robert? Well, first, we need to get the bulk of these funds into appropriate investment vehicles. 10 million sitting in a checking account earns virtually nothing and presents unnecessary security risks. He opened a leather portfolio and extracted several colorful brochures. I'd recommend a diversified approach, some in conservative CDs, some in money market accounts, and a portion in higher yield investment instruments for long-term growth. I felt my anxiety spike. These decisions felt enormous, permanent. I think I need time to research this, maybe consult with other financial advisors. Claire, David said gently, Robert is a financial advisor. He's been managing money in this community for 15 years. Your father trusted him completely. David's absolutely right, Robert agreed, and with current market conditions, timing is important. I have access to some exclusive investment opportunities that won't be available indefinitely. He slid another form toward me. This particular instrument, for instance, is only available to our highest net worth clients. It's a government-backed security with exceptional returns, guaranteed 7% annually. 7 million? My voice cracked when I saw the investment amount. It's the minimum buy-in for this program, but the returns more than justify it. Your father would want you to maximize the value of his sacrifice.
Something about their united insistence made me hesitate, but grief had clouded my judgment. I was exhausted from months of caregiving, overwhelmed by decisions I'd never had to make, and desperate to trust the two men closest to me. I signed the papers. Over the next 6 weeks, I tried to settle into a new normal. I took a leave of absence from my substitute teaching job, claiming I needed time to handle my father's estate and adjust to our changed circumstances. In truth, I was struggling with a grief so profound it felt physical, a constant ache in my chest that made simple tasks like grocery shopping or paying bills feel insurmountable. David was wonderfully supportive during this time. He took over many of the practical matters that seemed beyond my emotional capacity, handling the sale of farm equipment, arranging for the demolition of outbuildings that weren't part of the development deal, and helping me sort through decades of belongings in my childhood home. We should think about buying a bigger place, he suggested one evening as we sat in our small living room, surrounded by boxes of my mother's china and my father's farming journals. I'm not ready for that kind of change yet, I said. Of course not, David replied quickly. I just meant eventually, when you're ready to think about the future. But something in his tone made me wonder if his patience had limits I hadn't considered. 3 months after my father's funeral, on a cold February morning with snow threatening in the gray sky, I decided to check on our investments. I hadn't heard anything from Robert since that initial meeting, and I was curious about how the money was performing. I drove downtown through streets lined with bare oak trees and houses where people had lived for generations. Main Street looked like a postcard of small-town America, local businesses with hand-painted signs, a courthouse square with a Civil War monument, and the reassuring presence of institutions like the bank that had weathered decades of economic changes. But when I walked into Willowbrook Community Bank that morning, something felt different. The usual bustle of small-town banking seemed subdued, and several employees avoided making eye contact with me. When I asked to see Robert, Mrs. Duncan looked genuinely uncomfortable. I'm sorry, Claire, but Mr. Henley is in meetings all day. Perhaps someone else could help you? I just wanted to check on our investments, the CDs and the government securities program. Mrs. Duncan's face went pale. I think you need to speak directly with Mr. Henley. Could you come back tomorrow? That evening I mentioned the strange encounter to David. We were in our kitchen, the yellow walls and checkered curtains suddenly feeling too cheerful for my growing unease. You're probably just being paranoid, David said without looking up from his laptop. Banking is complicated. These things take time to process. It's been 3 months, David. Claire, you need to trust the professionals. Robert knows what he's doing. His tone carried a hint of irritation that I'd rarely heard before. Your grief is making you see problems where they don't exist. His dismissal stung, but I pushed the feeling aside. Maybe he was right. Maybe loss had made me suspicious of everything. But the next morning I returned to the bank determined to get answers. This time, I didn't make an appointment. When Mrs. Duncan tried to deflect me again, I walked past her desk and knocked firmly on Robert's door. Claire! Robert looked genuinely startled when I entered his office. This is unexpected. Mr. Henley, I need to understand what's happening with my investments.
I'm getting vague responses and it's making me nervous." Robert's face had gone ashen. He gestured for me to sit but remained standing himself, pacing nervously behind his desk. Through his window I could see the courthouse square where my great-grandfather had once sold produce from a wagon, where my father had learned to drive, where my own childhood had unfolded in the safety of a community that felt like family. "There have been some complications with the government securities program," he said, finally, not meeting my eyes. "Administrative delays at the federal level. Nothing to worry about, but the paperwork is taking longer than expected." "What kind of complications?" "Regulatory compliance issues. You know how bureaucracy can be."
Every instinct my father had taught me about reading people was screaming danger. Robert was sweating despite the cool temperature in his office, his hands shaking as he shuffled papers on his desk. "Mr. Henley, I want to see the documentation for these investments, the actual certificates or bonds." "That's not possible right now. The instruments are being held by the Federal Reserve Bank for verification. I want to withdraw from the program, transfer the money back to my checking account." The silence that followed stretched like a chasm. In that silence, I felt my world shift on its axis for the second time in 6 months. "Claire," Robert said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, the funds aren't accessible for early withdrawal without significant penalties." "How significant?" "I need to call David," he said, reaching for his phone with trembling hands. "Why do you need to call my husband about my money?" But he was already dialing, and I heard David's voice through the speakerphone, tinny and distant. "Is she there? Asking questions?" "Yes, and she wants to withdraw from the program." "Stall her. I'm coming over." The blood drained from my face as the pieces clicked into place. David? My David, who had held me while I cried over my father's diagnosis, who had stood beside me at the funeral, who had promised to help me honor my father's memory, had been planning to steal from me? Why? The word came out as a broken whisper.
"Because $10 million doesn't come along every day," David's voice said from the doorway. I turned to see my husband standing there, but he looked like a stranger. Gone was the gentle concern, the loving support. In its place was something cold and calculating. And because we earned it, dealing with your grief and your father's impossible expectations. My father's impossible expectations? The Saint Act got old, Claire. Poor William Patterson, the noble farmer. Do you have any idea what it was like, living in the shadow of his perfection? Listening to everyone in town talk about what a wonderful man he was while I worked my ass off to prove I was worthy of his precious daughter? I stared at this man I'd shared a bed with for 3 years, this man I'd trusted with my deepest fears and dreams. "You stole my father's legacy, the money he died to give me. Your father's dead, Claire. That money was just sitting there, earning nothing while you wallowed in grief. At least now it's being put to productive use." "Productive use?" David's expression shifted to something almost like pity. "Robert and I have been planning this for over a year. We've got business opportunities lined up, investments that will triple our money within 2 years. You'll get your share when it all pays off." "My share? Of my own money?" "Our money," David corrected. "We're married, remember. What's yours is mine and what's mine is yours. That's how it works." I felt something crack inside me, not break, but crack like ice under pressure, creating fissures that would eventually split my old life from whatever came next. "Where's the rest of it?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "The other 3 million?" David and Robert exchanged glances. "That's safely invested as well," Robert said. "But Claire, you need to understand. If you make trouble, if you go to the authorities, that money will be moved offshore where you'll never recover it. Your best bet is to trust us and wait for the returns." "Trust you." I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady, but my resolve hardening. "You've stolen everything my father died to give me and you want me to trust you?" "We haven't stolen anything," David said, his voice taking on an edge of anger. "We've made a business decision with family assets. If you can't see the logic in that, maybe you're not as smart as your father thought you were."
The cruelty in his words was like a slap. I walked toward the door on legs that felt disconnected from my body, then stopped and turned back. "This isn't over," I said, surprised by the steel in my own voice. David laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Actually, Claire, it is. We hold all the cards here. You can accept the situation and eventually profit from it, or you can fight us and lose everything. Your choice." I left the bank in a daze, driving home through streets that suddenly felt foreign and hostile. Nothing looked the same, not the courthouse where I'd paid property taxes with my father, not the church where I'd been married, not the small houses where I thought I was building a life with a man who loved me. That afternoon, while David was presumably covering his tracks at the bank, I began making phone calls. First to a lawyer in Nashville, then to the FBI field office, then to the Tennessee Banking Commission. I discovered that financial fraud was complex, that proving theft by a spouse was difficult, that offshore accounts were nearly impossible to trace without international cooperation. But I also discovered something else. I was not the helpless victim David and Robert assumed me to be. Over the next several weeks, as my marriage disintegrated and David grew increasingly hostile, I documented everything. I secretly recorded conversations, photographed documents left carelessly on David's desk, and researched both men's financial activities. I learned that they had been planning this theft for over a year, that they had created false investment documents using the bank's letterhead, and that they had already moved most of my money to accounts in the Cayman Islands.
The divorce papers were served on a Thursday morning in March. David's reaction was swift and vicious. He moved out of our house and immediately filed counterclaims, alleging that I was mentally unstable due to grief and incompetent to manage my own finances. He painted himself as the victim of a hysterical widow who couldn't accept sound financial advice. The legal battle was brutal and expensive. David and Robert had prepared their defense carefully, creating a paper trail that made their theft look like legitimate investment management gone wrong. They portrayed me as a grieving woman who had authorized the transactions and was now suffering from buyer's remorse. But I had advantages they didn't expect. I had grown up in Willowbrook, where people remembered my father and my family's reputation. I had recordings of their admissions. And most importantly, I had discovered that they had made one crucial mistake. They had used the bank's equipment and letterhead to create false documents, which constituted federal fraud. The FBI investigation took 8 months, but when it concluded, both David and Robert were arrested on charges of conspiracy, wire fraud, and money laundering.
The evidence I had gathered proved that they had deliberately created false investment instruments to steal my inheritance. David was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Robert received 8 years after cooperating with authorities to help recover some of the stolen funds. In the end, I recovered about $6 million of the original $10 million. The rest had been lost to their failed business ventures and the costs of maintaining offshore accounts. But the money, while important, wasn't the real victory. The real victory was refusing to remain silent, refusing to accept the role of victim that they had planned for me. It was proving that my father's faith in me had been justified, that I was capable of fighting for what was right even when the people closest to me betrayed that trust. Today, 5 years later, I live in a small house outside Nashville where I've started a consulting business helping other victims of financial fraud navigate the legal system. I never remarried. The scars from David's betrayal run too deep for that kind of trust. But I've built a life that honors my father's memory in ways that money alone never could. I still drive past the old farm sometimes, now transformed into Autumn Ridge with its winding streets and suburban lawns. The oak trees my great-grandfather planted still shade the houses, and sometimes I imagine he would approve of families raising children under their branches, even if those families never knew the history of the soil beneath their feet. My father's legacy wasn't really the $10 million he left me. It was the values he instilled, the belief that right matters more than profit, that integrity isn't negotiable, and that sometimes justice requires standing up to the people who claim to love you most. I kept my promise to him after all. I used his gift wisely, built something beautiful with it, and refused to let betrayal define the rest of my story. The money may be mostly gone, but the lesson it taught me, about my own strength, about the importance of fighting for what is right, that legacy will last forever. And that, I think, is exactly what he intended.